Well, at the time, I'd kind of developed this philosophy of saying yes.
Yeah.
I thought, always say yes, because it's saying no that closes things down. So when we saw this job advertised to count the lorries, we was like, why not? How bad can it be? And the pay was really good. And then with America, it was advertised at the university, so I was like, well, why not?
Yeah.
I've never been to America. So I was starting to develop this philosophy of say yes to everything.
Hi, and welcome to the There's Another Way podcast with me, Adam Halverson.
And me, Pete Dolby. And you've come to the place where each episode we'll be shining a light on authentic people who have chosen an alternative path to their new normal to find another way.
Today, we've got the first of a two-part conversation with Chris Pagett. In the current day, Chris is a trained cognitive behavioural therapist, and during this conversation, we go deep on his training and insights in the current state of the mental health crisis this country is suffering with. But before that, we go into Chris's fascinating past of growing up in the West Midlands and how just saying yes inspired a tale of twists and turns, unique decisions, overcoming chronic shyness with a yes man philosophy, and being only a breath away from death. This is a long conversation because frankly we didn't want it to end, and we've decided to break it into two parts because each half covers so much interesting stuff in different ways. We love this conversation. We think you will too. Enjoy.
Hello everyone, welcome to There's Another Way podcast episode 7. It's great to be here, and we'd love to welcome Chris Pagett with us today, if I said that correctly, Chris.
Yes, you have.
Brilliant. Well, great. Thank you so much for coming. I know we have tried to schedule this recording about 17 times, so it's really nice that we finally got to have you here, and we've been really excited to have you on the recording.
Thank you.
It's great to have you here. So.
Yeah, really been looking forward to this, and thanks. I think we had 2 bouts of COVID. I had it, you had it. I then went into hospital, happy days, and now we're back here, ready to go. So yeah, thanks.
So finally we're all well.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is nice.
Yeah,
there's still time. We've still got a few hours, let's see. But no, it's great to be back. So, Chris, so just as by means of introduction, so we were talking just before we started recording. So you are by profession a CBT therapist.
Yeah, I'm a therapist who specialises in cognitive behavioural therapy. So
Yes.
you see it in the press as CBT.
Yes.
All the time.
Okay.
Most recently with the menopause. It's a way of quite quickly dealing with and approaching people's problems, whether they be depression, anxiety. Apparently the menopause now, as I said, that was a bit of a surprise to us all. It's a particular way of doing therapy. It sits there alongside all the other types of therapy, psychodynamic therapy, things like that, all the talking therapies.
Right.
So it's a non-medication based approach to helping people with mental health.
Brilliant. And you're right, I've heard a lot about the menopause in the public eye at the moment as well, which is really interesting. Is it safe to say that you've been a busy chap for the last few months and years with the way the world is at the moment?
Oh, God, yeah, absolutely. Every therapist will tell you that. We could all work 2-3 times as much as we do and still wouldn't be making much of a dent, actually. There's a crisis in the NHS, as we know. There's a huge backlog there. There's a similar crisis in mental health. There's a lot of people who need support, and there's only limited support there for them. It relies quite heavily on the private sector, which causes even more problems because a lot of people can't pay. And while I would love to treat as many people as I could for free, I have things like a mortgage and bills.
Of course.
So it's a very stressful, difficult environment at the moment. And it's interesting to watch the numbers of therapists. There are lots of therapists who are leaving the profession, lots of people who are moving into it because it is something you can do as self-employed, do some training, get registered, and quite quickly build a practice. But it takes its toll.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is the bottom line, yeah.
And I'm fascinated to learn the journey that's got you into the profession, and like you said, it takes its toll. It's not easy on therapists either. It's an intense profession. But before I guess we get into that, I'd love to sort of know a little bit. We met, I suppose, in the last couple of years, quite recently. So, if it's all right, it'd be great to have an understanding of, where was home, where did things start, and go into that a little bit.
Sure, yeah. I was born in 1971 in Willenhall in the Black Country in the Midlands. So I arrived at pretty much the point when a lot of the manufacturing base that was in the Midlands decided to leave. So my dad was an engineer, he was a foreman of a tool-making shed. So him and his team made the tools that the lock makers used to make the locks, because that was what Willenhall was famous for, making locks. But I think, and I was talking to my dad this week to try and find out exactly when it happened, and he's as vague on it as I am. But about 1972, 1973, a lot of that went away,
right.
Like a lot of the manufacturing in the UK. So my dad was unemployed a lot of the time. It wasn't quite poverty, if I'm absolutely honest. Well, certainly I didn't see it that way, but we certainly didn't have very much, and the entire area was very impoverished. I was part of a traditional post-war family, that sort of thing, I guess. So I've got 16 aunts and uncles, wow. 20 odd cousins, of which I was the youngest. All of whom lived in sort of 2 square miles.
Wow.
And that was my world. I didn't really know much beyond that as I grew up. It was fun. There was plenty of people to play with and plenty of things to do, and there was always some kind of family party going on. Mostly because it was always somebody's birthday or anniversary or wedding or something. But not a lot of money. My dad had to work days. My mum worked nights because it was the only way they could handle the childcare. But yeah, it was. It's odd looking back on it, because when you're there at the time, you just accept it for what it is. And then as I moved on through my life, I've done and said things where people have gone, well, that's not normal. That's how poor were you that you couldn't afford this or you couldn't do that. So I don't really want to go too much on about it, but it was a fairly basic childhood, from that point of view.
But it sounds like it was a positive, happy one, was it?
Oh yeah. It was very happy in that sense, but it was a very narrow world. We did go on holiday, really. We occasionally went down to Bournemouth to a static caravan. We never really travelled anywhere or did very much in terms of arts or culture or any of that kind of thing. It was very much family focused and getting on with life as best they could. And my parents were permanently stressed. I can see that now, because there were only ever one boiler failure or, a car breakdown away from financial ruin, really. So they worked extremely hard and never really seemed to break the cycle.
Yeah.
And I guess with your profession now, you've probably done some retroactive or retrospective thinking about it, and I guess probably understood it even more, and probably understood maybe more what their situation in reality was.
I recognise the signs of stress now as I was growing up. I just thought it was just the way my mum and dad behaved, but there was arguments going on. There was a layer of tension in the house.
Yeah.
Me and my brother's even taller than I am. I'm 6'2", he's 6'4", so we were growing all the time, and it used to be a real source of stress that they couldn't afford clothes for us. And if they did buy clothes for us, we would grow out of them in 6 weeks, and that would cause pressure. It was a very positive childhood from the point of view of my parents always encouraged me to do the things I wanted to do. And it was fun having all the cousins around, even if I was the youngest. So I kind of got dragged along to whatever they were doing. But not a lot of money, not a lot of aspirations. It's probably clearly shown by my school that I went to, my secondary school, Poolhouse Comprehensive, which was full of people. There was 1,500 students there, but it was massively under-resourced.
Yeah, that's a big school.
Yeah, it's a big school.
Yeah.
Half of it was Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi kids, because there was a large population there. So I kind of grew up not really thinking about racism at all, because my mates were Hardip and Iqbal and Andrew and Tom, it didn't make any difference to me. So that was very positive. But it was lots of people and not very many teachers. We were mostly in porter cabins, which is not a great thing to do in the middle of winter. Not a great thing to do in the summer either. And there was a constant turnover of teachers because they couldn't recruit people to stay there for very long because nobody wanted to work in what was probably seen as being quite a horrible area to live. So the education level wasn't very good. The aspiration level wasn't very good. Very few of us went through to the sixth form because there was no incentive to do that. The school kind of begrudgingly let you go to the sixth form if you did okay in your GCSEs. But again, it was that lack of aspiration, lack of, there was no going to university, no thinking about a career. The idea was you went to school until you could legally finish at 16 at that point, and the idea was then you then went to work. They would let you stay at the sixth form, but my parents didn't like the idea because they wanted me to work. The school didn't like the idea, but they got funding, so I guess they had to balance things out. But when I was doing my A-levels, there was still no talk about going to university because people didn't. Nobody in my family went to university.
Was it almost a bit frowned upon? It's like, what's wrong with just doing what we do? Or...
I don't know how much I'm allowed to swear on this.
Our last one was full of it, so whatever you want.
Our swear tin is pretty full of it.
The feeling was that going to university is what posh wankers did. It's what the kids from the grammar school down the road did. It's not what we did. We were, the careers advice was, you need to get a job. Ideally something, working with your hands, because that's a proper job. Anything else isn't real. So there was no real incentive to even look at university. But I wanted to go to university. I'd read about university in books. I knew they existed. So there was a few of us who got together and we kind of formed our own little university club and applied to university. In those days you had to write off for a prospectus, get the prospectus to come back, apply via paper forms. I am really old, aren't I? So we did that as there was 4 or 5 of us who thought we really want to go to university, so we kind of drove that ourselves.
And were your parents aware of that application and supported you in it?
Yeah, but they didn't really understand what it meant.
Right.
They heard me talking about it and they knew I was doing it, but they had no real concept, because I say nobody had gone to university in my family. They knew it from things like Brideshead Revisited or stuff they'd seen on the TV. There was no idea that I would actually go to university. So when I passed my A-levels, so I'm back a little bit. So I got a place to go to Liverpool to do physics.
Wow.
I passed my A-levels and came home all excited. My parents said, "Well, you can't go. We don't know how. We haven't got the money. You can't go to university. How's that going to work?" They had no concept of it actually
but actually,
being a thing.
But also, you're not just going to university. You're going to a red brick hard degree. That's sort of what the grammar school kids did. It's not like you were going to a polytechnic and scraping in. You'd actually got tough degree. Obviously, got good marks and got into a tough uni.
Yeah, in Liverpool, which again they couldn't. They had no idea, no concept. Yeah. So my world kind of imploded at that point because without my parents supporting me. And also it was a sort of wake-up call for me that I didn't know how to go to university. I'd never gone away from home. I'd never travelled anywhere. I had no idea what I was doing.
Not really thought about the actual practical reality.
So for 3 or 4 days, me and my parents kind of bounced around the subject. And then my dad quite bravely said, "Look, let's just do it." But then when I called Liverpool, I'd lost my place because I hadn't contacted them. Didn't even know I had to contact them and say, "Look, I'm thinking about it," or whatever. They hadn't heard from me, so they assumed that I'd failed my A-levels and they'd given the place away.
What a shame.
Well, yeah, but again, we didn't know anything about what we were doing, so we didn't know that the places back then were listed in the Times newspaper. So my dad, bless him, drove around every newsagent in the local area trying to find back copies of the Times so we could see if there was anything else I could do.
Like through clearing or something?
Yeah. And I talked to UCAS, but they basically said, you need to look at the times, you need to see what places are available, and then come back to us. We can't do a search for you. So in the end, it just didn't happen. So I had to get a job. So I applied for a few things, and
sorry. Just to come in there, it's amazing that if you think about it, like a sliding doors moment. You know, it's because obviously I've been to university and took it so much for granted. Like, just I went through clearing, but you know, it was a very last minute thing. And obviously, but I'm in an environment where everyone's doing it. Everyone knows what it is. You know what I mean? And obviously we're in a digital age even then. So it was like, so, but
I
actually,
was definitely analog back then.
Yeah, but obviously you think about it, like how would you know? And you know, how would you get that insight? No internet.
Especially if the local area, there's not many people that have been there.
Exactly.
You know?
Yeah, and the school was shut. There was nobody I could speak to at the school other than the school secretary, who, you know, bless her heart, she tried, but she's very limited things that she could do. And it wasn't just me. Out of the 5 of us who pushed hard to go, only 2 actually went.
Right.
For the same reasons that when reality arrived, it was a case of, well, you can't. This is not something that we do around here. So anyway, I applied to join Waitrose management scheme.
Again, that's quite a different direction to using your hands and finding a job in the area. Isn't it? Yeah.
Well, I wasn't convinced by that because everybody I knew, of all my uncles who had gone down that route, they'd all lost their jobs.
Right. Okay.
And there wasn't any jobs using your hands.
Right. So it's kind of already come to the end of its kind of...
Oh, God, yeah.
So
and
even
back then...
Was it not even an option in a way? It was almost... Because I was going to ask, was there sort of like an inbuilt ambition, do you think, in you? Or was it, you know, to do something a bit different?
My dad had always encouraged me to read a lot. And I love reading. Even now I read. So I was known as the kid who carried a book around with me. Everywhere I went, I had a book with me. And because of that, my worldview had expanded.
Yeah.
More so than most of the people around me. That's what made a difference, I think. Right. I thought there were possibilities that I could go to university, I could do more. The world was a far bigger place than the 2 square miles centred around Willenhall.
Yeah.
And as you start talking to other people, and, you know, I did have a couple of friends who did go to university, so I was still in touch with them by letter, if you believe it.
Yeah.
And they were saying about the experiences they were having, and that again sort of encouraged me to think that there is a bigger world out there. There's another way. That works quite nicely. So I applied to Waitrose. At the time, I didn't know they were a supermarket.
What do you think it was?
I thought they were I knew they were to do with groceries and things, but I thought they were a warehousing company that provided, because the only supermarkets I knew were Asda and Tesco's.
Yeah.
I didn't know the Waitrose was a supermarket.
And then when you did, you realised it was like the universities for posh wankers.
Yes, absolutely. So I got on it. I think I was a diversity hire because of my accent. So they put me in their Stourbridge office, which is north of Birmingham, and it was known as the Wild West because at the time, again, this shows how long ago this was. That was the most northerly Waitrose in the network,
right.
And it was a good 100 miles north of any other one, and it was seen as being a bit of an outpost.
Yeah.
So they sent me there for 6 months. Worked on the fresh food counters, learned a hell of a lot about fish. I can still descale and fillet a fish like you wouldn't believe. Patisserie, hams, all the things that you see on the fresh. And it was a different place. I was suddenly found myself amongst what I would call middle class people.
Yeah.
Leading middle class lives. And it was a real eye-opener for me about the fact that there was a different world out there, that there were more opportunities and that there was another level of living, if you want to call it that wasn't quite as subsistence as I was used to, that there was a level where you could start having some luxuries. I'd see these people coming in at Christmas and buying all these things, all these foods and things. I'm thinking, my God, how can you eat all of that? And again, it changed my perspective. And then they, after 6 months, every 6 months, they rotated you to a different store. So I was sent down to Bath, which was one of their flagship stores, or as I called it, Bath. And
so you added the R in there.
Yeah. Well, eventually I did. So I was there for a couple of weeks, and then the branch manager took me to one side and said, "Look, nobody understands a word you're saying. We can't get past the accent. I don't want to be rude." He was very nice about it. He said, "But we can't understand you. Customers can't understand you." So he said, "Would you object if we sent you for elocution lessons?" So I went and did those for a few months and learned how to talk proper like.
How long did it take before it kicked in, would you say?
The basics quite quickly.
Yeah.
It wasn't difficult because I did speak English. I just had a really thick accent.
But it's habitual, isn't it, the way you speak? I guess if you remove yourself from the environment that you're in, where everyone speaks the same way.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's a bit like learning a foreign language, I guess. If the best way to learn it is to go and live there.
Exactly.
Everybody around me spoke very nicely and added extra R's that I didn't think existed. But anyway.
But how was it when you went back home with that, with the updated?
Oh,
accent?
by then they'd
you
already
slip
assumed I
back
was
in?
a posh wanker.
Okay.
Yeah, because I worked at Waitrose.
Right.
And by then people had figured out what Waitrose was.
Yeah.
What was it? What was the reaction at home? Were people pleased? Were people sort of like, oh, look what Chris is doing, or was it like, oh, are we not good enough for him?
I haven't seen not in a bad way, but I haven't seen my family, apart from my immediate family, in probably 25 years.
Right.
Wow.
And I say not in a bad way at all. They kind of accepted the fact. They always thought I was a bit weird because I was reading all the time. And I was doing A-levels and wanted to go to university. So they always thought that I was a bit odd. So they are proud of the journey I've been on, I think, from what I've heard from my mum and dad. But I very quickly, it sounds horrible, but I very quickly accelerated away from them.
Yeah.
And very quickly there wasn't a lot left in common, really. So it wasn't a bad thing. It was a growth thing for me. So when I did go back again, I mean, there wasn't so much a language barrier as a cultural barrier that I had moved on from there, which I felt really bad about for a long time. It's not great that you don't have your full family there to support you. But I had my mum and dad. Some of my cousins also were still there. It wasn't a case of they hated me or I hated them. We just literally drifted apart because they all stayed in the Midlands, and I ended up in Bath, I ended up in London, I ended up all over the place, but I never really went home at all.
Okay. And was there did anyone sort of be like, oh, I fancy a bit of that, and sort of see the aspirational side and maybe...
I've been told by my mum and dad that it has had that effect.
Okay.
That there are people in not so much my cousins, because I was the youngest, it didn't really have that effect, but their kids have been told stories about me, and they've started to go to university. The access to university has obviously opened up massively from when I was there. But again, that aspiration has started to creep in. Not just me, as I said. University is more accessible. The West Midlands is doing better now than it was at the time. So there's a number of factors there. But I proved you could escape, for want of a better phrase. I'm
fascinated by the fact that your dad kind of encouraged you to read, because I was listening to a podcast a few weeks ago and it was saying what impact reading has on the succession rate of kids further down the line.
My dad he's a Yorkshireman, so he's very pragmatic and he says it as it is, and he worked incredibly hard. Yeah. When he wasn't working at work, he worked at BT installing telephones, because that was the only job that he could find. He was working on the home to make it better. He was very good with his hands. Yeah. So he was working all the time, but he always took time out to make sure that me and my brother were encouraged in the things that we wanted to do. So my brother's more sporty, so they encouraged him to go down the route of cricket and rugby. They could see that I was more interested in science and reading. So, I remember being about 8 years old, I think I was, and I'd pretty much read everything in the children's library at Walsall Library, which was the main library near us. And I remember standing there as my dad was having what I now recognise as quite a heated discussion with the librarian, saying, look, my son has read everything there. And she's going, well, he needs to read in the adult section now. And she's like, well, he's only 8. He can't go into the adult. He's like, well, that's my decision as his parent, not yours. So he did convince them to get me to go into the adult section. That sounds wrong. The older adult. No, that's the older books. Yeah. So that again opened up another world for me, because I stopped reading books that were written for children, started reading books that were written for adults. Yeah. And that was because of my dad standing up for me. And he did lots of other things as well. I mean, we didn't, as I said before, we didn't have a huge amount of money, but he managed to find money to buy us a ZX81. Because he could see that because he worked at BT, he could see that computers were the future.
With the rubber keys?
Yeah, with the rubber keys, absolutely. Yeah. 1K, black and white. Yeah. And after that, he bought us the 16K RAM pack, which introduced us to colour. The point being that he taught us how to code, he taught us how to use computers, because he knew that would be a really important skill to have. Yeah. And I learned later that meant quite a lot of sacrifice for my mum and dad, but it was something my dad really believed in. Brilliant. So we didn't have a TV for a year, and that was partly because they had bought the ZX Spectrum for us, because they wanted, my dad was totally clear about this, computers are the way forward, you need to know how to use them.
Wow, that's very perceptive, because that was an early phase in IT, wasn't it? I mean,
absolutely. So, and that has stuck with me ever since. I mean, both me and my brother are very computer literate. In our extended family, I'm the guy you come to. Yeah. When printers don't work and things like that.
Yeah, but it sounds like he really was quite forward thinking, and it sounds like he knew what he was doing. I think he was deeply affected by what happened to him about being made redundant, because he left school at 14. He'd worked his way up to be the foreman of, and being a tool maker in Willenhall was the sort of creme de la creme of engineering. So Willenhall was all about making locks, but to make locks you need specialist tools, and those tools have to be made out of certain metals because they're working on hardened steel. So being a tool maker was right at the top of the tree. Yeah. But as the industry collapsed, it was one of the first areas to get wiped out. And I think really within 6 months, my dad went from earning a very good wage and having a lot of respect and a lot of pride to being unemployed and, to a certain extent, unemployable. Because there was no manufacturing there. So unless we'd moved from the Midlands, which wasn't really, I think, on the cards at any point, there was nothing he could do. So he ended up working for BT installing telephones, which for him was quite a drop. And I was about to say he never complained. He did complain quite a lot, but no more so than anybody needed a job. He never complained about the fact that he'd had that fall. But I think it did mean that he was determined that his sons wouldn't go down the same path. Yeah. So with my brother, they encouraged him to join the Foreign Office, which was just out of the blue, really. Wow. And he went along, and my dad prepped him beforehand for weeks before, reading newspaper stories, going, even things like going through the atlas and saying, okay, well, where are all these countries? And my brother ended up working at the Foreign Office for 30 years.
Incredible. What made him choose? Did he just feel like it'd be a good fit for your brother, or was it a good balance,
I think it was actually as simple as he saw an advert in I think it was the Daily Mail or something. Right. They were looking for only admin people, but it was an opportunity. They would train you up, provide you with accommodation, and then they needed a lot of people at the time to help roll out new IT systems. Things like the passport and the visa stuff and all those kind of things at all the sites around the world. So then you're recruiting a lot of people to go and do that, and that's when my brother went in. So they saw it as an opportunity to get away from the Midlands, to go and join the Foreign Office, which would mean travel the world. Because that's one of the things my dad really regrets. He had the opportunity, what was it called, the £10 Poms or something? Yeah. They had the opportunity to do that and didn't. And then he had to work hard and didn't get very much holiday. So my dad's never really travelled. Towards the end of I mean, he's quite old now, but he did a bit. So it was driven a lot by my dad's experiences. He regretted certain things. He wanted to help us avoid things like that. So he probably thought a career in the Foreign Office was relatively redundancy-proof.
Yeah.
How true that is, I don't know. Well, it seems to be. My brother did all right.
But how commendable is that as well? That because a lot of people, when they take those hits, they can take it negatively and sort of spiral a little bit. But it sounds like his reaction was okay. In
the end, yeah, I think he did spiral at first.
Yeah.
He was unemployed for a couple of years, and that was really hard on him. I was too young at the time. I was maybe four or five when this was going on, so I don't really remember it. I remember my dad being around more than usual, but I had no concept of what that meant. My mum was going out and working as best she could, and then things kind of stabilised. I mean, both my parents ended up working at BT. My dad, as I say, installed telephones. My mum was a telephone operator, so the person who answered the phone when you picked it up. Yeah. And then director of inquiries.
Yeah.
But she did the night shift and my dad did the day. So we had, and she worked Sundays as well. So we had a couple of hours in the middle of the day when we got together to eat as a family, and then we had Saturday together, and then Sunday my dad would cook. It was either egg or chips or burgers and chips. That was it. That was the limit of his repertoire, but that was fine. As kids, we loved it. Yeah. And then my mum was working on the Sunday, and that was all the way through till I was about 17, something like that. Yeah.
Brilliant. I mean, that must have been really tough with your mum working night shifts. I can imagine it must have been.
It was. Again, there was a kid, you don't really think about it.
Yeah.
We had a couple of hours, and then my mum would disappear, and my dad would be there.
Yeah.
And then in the morning we'd get up, my mum would be back. She'd send us to school. She'd go to sleep, get up, and then do a bit of housework. Be there when we got back from school. I mean, I'm not just sure how they managed it. When you look back on it, it was probably more stressful for them.
Yeah.
Because I'm positive they got very little time together.
Yeah.
And when they did, they were probably knackered and stressed and constantly worrying about things. Usually money, about how they were going to make ends meet. But as I say, it wasn't an unhappy childhood. There was a lot of positives there, and my dad was a big driver of that. Yeah. He pushed us all the time. Sometimes it was annoying. You'd come home from school and he would say, right, okay, now we're going to talk about how a clutch works in a car.
Yeah.
I'm like, I don't want to talk about it. I want to watch Top of the Pops. I don't want to talk about how a clutch works in a car. But, it didn't mean that I then grew up knowing how a clutch works in a car, amongst other things.
Anyway. Like a great dad, I've
got a lot of time for my dad, My mum's lovely, but my dad was the driving force.
Yeah, it's brilliant, having the foresight to arm you with those skills, that skill set to get you out and into the wider world. So you said you were then at Waitrose and you travelled around a few different stores. So this was preparing you for the management role
So I was offered the dry goods assistant manager at the Winchester store. And I think my parents could see I wasn't particularly excited about it. I wasn't really. I think there are people who care about whether all the beans face forward, and there are people who don't.
I used to work in a supermarket and face them up like toy soldiers, the guy used to say.
Yeah, exactly.
And still, if I go to a supermarket now, sometimes I'll tweak the old one round.
I do as well. It's hardwired, isn't it?
Never leaves you.
Maybe I am the kind of person who does like them to all to face forward. I wasn't. I think I was still grieving a little bit that I hadn't gone to university because a couple of my friends had, and I was now moving in a different group. So I was sometimes managing kids who were home from university, and they were talking about their experiences. Right. They were the same age as me, but I was their manager. It was all a bit weird. So I think my dad picked up on the fact that I wasn't very happy. So bless them, they called me one night and said, we've talked about it. We think you should go to university. They told me this 3 days into clearing.
Oh, really?
So at least I had access to the Times newspaper, though, because I worked at Waitrose. So I had the back copies as well. And some of the people at Waitrose helped me as well. So they were calling as well to see what was available. I couldn't do the physics stuff. That was all gone. I could have done chemistry, but I wasn't really that interested in chemistry. But one of my other A-levels had been history. So I was able to get on to a course to do history. at Bangor in North Wales, of all places.
Oh.
So I ended up going there. I arrived 2 weeks late because I had to serve my notice period at Waitrose, and it was all very last minute. But yeah, I ended up moving very quickly from earning money at Waitrose in that kind of environment to being a penniless, pretty much student in North Wales.
Sleeping till 4 o'clock every day.
I wish. Yeah. I don't remember that. I'm sure I did, but
that's what they do these days.
But I was one of those annoying students who, because I had missed out the first time round, when I arrived, I'd done all the reading. I was dead keen, sticking my hand in the air. Nobody believed I was from the Black Country because I'd had elocution lessons. So I had finally morphed into a posh wanker, apparently. But I loved it. It was a brilliant time. I played rugby. I got into rock climbing, which was great. I mean, it was just... I mean, Bangor itself is a nice town, and it's a good university, but it's the location, really. I mean, you're right there at the end of the Ogwen Valley, the A5. You've got the whole of Snowdon. You've got Anglesey. You've got
it's beautiful around there, isn't it?
Oh, stunning! Yeah. It rains a lot, but it was stunning. So we used to spend quite a lot of time hitching out along the A5, climbing for the weekend, desperately hitching back in time for lectures. It was a really good time. I enjoyed it immensely. And I enjoyed studying. I mean, basically, I couldn't really believe that I now was free to just read. In fact, kind of I was paid to read all the time, if you want to look at it that way. Yeah. That was my job, to read and read and read and read, which I absolutely loved.
And you didn't have any regrets? Well, I guess that ship had sailed anyway, but going from physics to history is quite a change in direction, isn't it? So you felt that you'd chosen the right direction and the right course at that point?
No, if I'm absolutely honest. I still hankered to do the science stuff. Yeah. I'd always been interested in science as a kid. But I was grateful to be at university. Yeah. And I think it would have been taking the mickey if I had turned around to my parents a year in and said, well, actually, could I transfer to doing physics somewhere else? I think by that point as well, I'd also realised that physics wasn't what I thought it was. I thought it was about, blowing things up and, building amazing contraptions and working with your hands, really, oddly enough. But it wasn't. It was mostly about maths.
Very mathematics.
And it was getting more and more that kind of way. I still hankered for it, but I loved my degree. It was great. It was a nice university, nice lecturers, nice people. I made lots of friends, and I had a really great time. And it taught me things like the rock climbing stuff, which was brilliant. And again, really opened my eyes to what you could do. So, because I didn't want to put too much financial pressure on my parents, I worked a lot. So, for 2 Easter holidays, I worked at Calais Ferry Port, counting all the lorries in and out.
Oh, really?
Because it was the preliminary work. God, I'm so old. The preliminary work, the feasibility study for the Channel Tunnel.
Oh.
So they wanted to know how many lorries were crossing, what kind of lorries, and when they came back. So we were tracking their, all by pen and paper, tracking their registration numbers. So we had to list what kind of van they were, what kind of lorry they were. So me and my girlfriend were doing the midnight to 8 shift because it was 24 hours. And we did that because it was the way you got most money, because you got back to the hotel at 8 in the morning. It was dinner time, but it was bed and breakfast in the hotel, so that was our dinner. So we stuffed ourselves on breakfast. Then we didn't have to worry about eating for the rest of the time, so we managed to pocket most of there was a per diem for food and things. So we did that in the Easter holidays. In the summer, I went to America and worked as a cook on summer camps in America.
Oh, fantastic. Wow. Whereabouts in America?
The first time I was in New Hampshire, on one of the camps there. That was stunning. It was on an island in the lake. Yeah. Everything had to come in by boat. Yeah. Which was logistically challenging when you're the cook, but really good fun. And then I was in Philadelphia, just outside Philadelphia in Pennsylvania.
Whereabouts?
What was the name of the place? I could point to it on a map. It was about 25 minutes drive from south of Philadelphia. Okay. I can't remember the name. Actually,
my brother lives in Lancaster, PA, which is about 40 minutes south.
Okay.
Near an interestingly named town called Intercourse. which you may have remembered. But
I do remember the name Intercourse.
Yeah. So proper Amish country.
The camp was called Wamanui or something.
Okay.
I should be able to remember.
I'll check it out. I'll see how close it might be.
I could show you. Yeah, I could point to it on a map, but I can't because it was. I can't remember the name of the local town. But
again, so I guess you must have had a little bit of zest to go and do stuff and see things and.
Oh God, yeah, absolutely.
Well, and truly broken free from that local.
Yeah, I was the first time I flew on a plane. I was 21, and that was when I went to America the first time.
I was 20 when I went to America on a plane.
And it was brilliant. I mean, I was so excited about being on a plane, which, that feeling very rapidly disappears, doesn't it? But the first time I was like, ooh, sea goes up, sea goes down, sea goes up. They bring me drinks.
Was that your first ever flight when you went to America?
My first ever flight, yeah. Which then led to us staying the first night in Harlem in accommodation there. It was all set up by Bunac, who were the guys who organised it, which is when I heard my first gunshot.
Yeah.
But I thought, well, I'm in America now, aren't I? And then, we went to this camp, and they said, right, I'd been hired actually just as a kitchen worker, but the assistant cook hadn't turned up, so they said, does anybody fancy doing the assistant cook role? So I was like, yeah, why not? So I did that, and then I came back the next year to the one in Philadelphia as the cook, which was really good. Mostly because you don't have to deal with the kids too much.
Yeah. Did you get the Bunac brochure when you thumb through it and look at all the jobs that are available in America, and then you could think,
I looked through it all and I thought, well, I can't do that, and I can't do that, and I can't do that, and I can't do that. But I can work as an assistant in the kitchen. So I went over there thinking I was just doing grunt work. Because that's all I thought I could do. Because even then I still didn't think that I was that good at things. I kind of felt a certain amount of luck that I got to where I was. So I didn't want to push things too much. But as it turns out, being cook or assistant cook is one of the more powerful positions on the camp, because if anybody wants to do anything, if they want to go for a hike, if they want to have a party, they have to get permission from the cook, because we're the ones who order the food. And again, I learnt a lot. I had to deal with the rise of food allergies, food intolerances. I told a story a long time now about one of the mums who came along and handed me a list of all the things her son couldn't eat. And I was looking at this thinking, well, that leaves water.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, okay, I'm sure we can figure this out. And she drove off in her car, and I said to the kid, look, we'll figure something out. So when you come for the next meal, come and find me. And bless him, he turned up with the next meal and he went straight to the burgers. And I never saw him again, really. He just ate what everybody else ate.
Brilliant.
And then when his mum came to pick him up 3 or 4 weeks later or whatever, he was kind of looking at me thinking, oh, you're going to rat me out? And I was like, oh, no, he's been really good. He was fine. And the kid never looked healthier. So I don't know, So that was all very interesting. And cooking for 300 people 4 meals a day is a logistical nightmare.
It sounds like you're throwing yourself into these experiences and just be like, all right, let's crack on. And I guess that must be a little bit of maybe the background where you're just like, cool, yeah, we're good with the hands, let's just do it, let's go. Well, at
the time I'd kind of developed this philosophy of saying yes.
Yeah.
I thought, always say yes, because it's saying no that closes things down. So when we saw this job advertised to count the lorries, we was like, why not? How bad can it be? And the pay was really good. And then with America, it was advertised at the university. So I was like, well, why not?
Yeah.
I've never been to America. So I was starting to develop this philosophy of say yes to everything.
I'm just I'm fascinated where that comes from. And I maybe you can't even put a finger on it or really get to a base reason, but
at first it was what we would probably think of now as FOMO, fear of missing out. I just started to get this taste of a bigger world, and I liked it, and I was worried that at any point it was all going to go away, so maybe a bit of imposter syndrome in there as well. That somebody was going to tap me on the shoulder and say, no, you don't belong here, go back to Illinois, go back to some crappy job somewhere. because you don't deserve to be here. That was a mistake. So I thought the more I said yes, and the more opportunities I did, the further I would grow and the further I would get away from... I was running away at that time, if I'm being honest.
Yeah. And I guess also, but you think about how many people wouldn't take that half glass full approach. You know, again, you know, we'll come to it later, but obviously when you deal with anxiety, some people just couldn't handle that. They couldn't chuck themselves into unknown situations.
Yeah.
So...
yeah, and it takes its toll. Like I said, I mean, I don't have many regrets, but one of them is the fact that I am so distant from my extended family. They're not bad people at all. They're lovely people. But the gap is too large, and eventually you can't go back. And that is one of the regrets. And that's when this all started, because I was going to France to count lorries. I was in the summer. I was in America, which meant that I wasn't going home. I went home maybe twice in the 3 years I was at university.
It's that classic phrase, isn't it? You have to choose your regrets. And, you know, you made the choice to go and live, effectively.
Yeah. So, I mean, my daughter's at university now. She barely contacts us, as is typical for a 19-year-old. And my dad thinks it's hilarious because he's like, well, you didn't speak to us for 3 years. We never saw you.
Yeah.
You know, you could have been dead for all we knew. Because back then it was either... We had one telephone in the residential hall, and we didn't have telephones in the houses we were living in afterwards. Everything was, you had to letter occasionally.
Yeah.
So he thinks it's hilarious that I don't hear from my daughter, even though there's a million ways to communicate now.
Sorry, mate.
No, I just love that say yes approach to everything, because I feel like I'm like that. Whether it's work, someone says, hey, we've got this project, do you want to get stuck in? Yes, please. I just try and always say yes to stuff. You seen Yes Man the movie, obviously. Have you seen that? I mean, that I love that story. But I just think opportunities arise and things come along, and you look back and think, well, actually, if I hadn't have said yes to that, I certainly wouldn't be doing this. I wouldn't be sitting in here talking to you if I hadn't have said yes to a few things along the way, and I wouldn't have met my wife.
Yeah,
I wouldn't have my kids. So I wouldn't. I can track it back a long way, and I just think, yes, I mean, okay, maybe sometimes you take on too much, but I think it's a great attitude to have.
Well, you can always rein it back if you have to.
Yeah.
As I say, the things you regret are the things you say no to.
Yeah.
So I went through university and I loved it. And then at the end of university, you know, got my bright, shiny degree. I had no idea what I wanted to do with
I was going to ask, actually, with history, because I love history. My daughter seems to be taking to it. Did you have any idea during it where it might lead? Or
No, none at all. None at all. I was genuinely just enjoying the fact that I was... at university, studying, talking about these amazing things.
In a way, that's sorry to interrupt, but that's great, because obviously you're present in it.
Yeah.
You're not necessarily focused on an outcome.
Yeah.
You're actually like, I'm just doing it.
Yeah. Well, oddly enough as well, I always had a certain confidence that I would always be able to find work, because I was always prepared to do whatever it takes. So, as I said, going to America, I was quite happy to go as the lowest of the low, kitchen hand kind of thing.
Yeah.
Didn't bother me in the slightest, because, again, one of the things my dad had taught me is that it doesn't matter what you're doing at work, it's work itself that is important. And you might come home smelling of shit because you've been working all day in a horrible environment, but it doesn't matter as long as you take pride in your work.
It's character building as well, and you put it down to experience, and you probably met a load of great people there, and learned a lot about yourself, and grew.
I learned how to cook.
Grew as part of the experience.
You know, in quite a brutal way, but I learned how to cook. So even now I still love cooking.
Yeah, completely.
I didn't really think about it. After I finished at university, I sort of bummed around the Lake District for a bit, working in hotels, working at outdoor centres in Estale and various other places. Again, just quite enjoying myself. My girlfriend lived up there as well, so I lived with her parents, which I don't think they necessarily appreciated. They thought, who the hell is this guy coming and living here? And he seems to have no ambition, really, in terms of what he wants to do with his life. But I eventually woke up to the fact that I couldn't just do that forever. It was a nice enough thing, but I did want to do more. So I packed a rucksack and moved to London.
Did
I had a promise of a job in advertising sales, but that never really materialised. But I arrived...
I did.
Sorry?
I did, yeah. I got into advertising sales after uni.
Yeah, I think a lot of people did, because that was one of the things that was available, wasn't it? Particularly in London. But I'm trying to remember now. There was some magazine in London. It was yellow. I remember it being yellow.
It's exactly what I did. I mean, I was going to say you didn't miss much, but actually, to be honest, it was brilliant. Actually, just in terms of base understanding of sales and how to interact with people. Great training. I worked on a series of building and architecture magazines. And then moved on to like.
No, this was for law firms. But,
okay.
But I say never really materialised.
A mate of mine worked on The Lawyer. So,
okay.
Yeah, so, who knows? Could have been the same, potentially
no,
thing.
this was this was a directory for law firms.
Okay.
So it was one of those kind of things.
Yeah.
But they were dragging their feet, and I don't think I really fit their typical profile. But by then I'd found somewhere to live. A lovely guy called Howard had a house in Balham.
Nice place to go as well.
Yeah, it was very nice. So there were 5 girls and me.
Even better.
How did you go for it about that?
We'd split up by that point.
Okay.
The move to London had done that.
Right.
So I was looking for work. I did the usual thing, applied for graduate schemes. But I went for an interview with a recruitment company called Computer People.
I've used them before.
Yeah. Well, they were probably the biggest at the time. I don't know how big they are now, but and I got the job. Oddly enough, a whole bunch of graduates were there, and we did the usual psychometric testing and team exercises and things like that. And at the end of it, they said, "Right, we finished for the day. This is not part of the interview. It's all done. We're going for a drink. Do you want to come?" And I was the only one who said yes. And we went there, and they said, "Well, actually, that was part of the test."
Oh, was it? Yeah.
So, if you want the job, you've got it.
Brilliant,
fantastic.
So
because they wanted somebody.
Again.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was precisely that. They wanted somebody who was willing to say, "Well, why not? Let's go."
Yeah.
And not be intimidated.
Not that England's got a booze culture at all, but.
It was recruitment in the 90s. What do you think?
Absolutely.
So
and by
again,
the way, it's weird. I also had a stint in recruitment, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, then the next bit will probably chime for you. In that, again, it opened up. I was in London. I was in IT recruitment, which was bizarrely quite a sexy thing at the time. I was working in the international bit, so what we were doing was finding people in the UK to go and work for Microsoft and Oracle over in the US. So they sent me over to New York for 6 weeks to help out with recruitment there. I was having the time of my life. It was brilliant. I had no responsibilities. I was living in a house with 5 girls, which was lovely. Nothing ever happened like that, not at all. They were like sisters.
Yeah.
And girls were a lot nicer to live with than boys, I've got to say.
Yeah.
That it was always kept clean, and there was always food in the fridge. And they liked having me around because I could handle the telephone system that we had. So I'm going a bit of a divergence here, but I always like this story. Next to the phone, there was a whiteboard with all the girls' names, and then it listed the boyfriends and people who they might be interested in and what the response was. So if I was in the house, I always had to answer and then check the whiteboard. It was like, "Oh, you want to speak to Rosie? And you're Ian. Oh, yeah. Sorry, she's not here." And Rosie was standing right next to me.
She's washing her hair.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
So I acted as a very effective gatekeeper for them. But yeah, it was absolutely brilliant. So I came across what I would refer to really as one of my first mentors at that point as well, a guy called Craig Coverman. Am I allowed to say names?
Yeah, well,
Okay.
as long as he doesn't mind. Yeah. We don't really know.
No.
We don't really know what we're doing. So as long as he's not offended, I don't know what the.
Well, it's all very positive, so I'm sure he won't be.
Yeah.
He was excellent salesman, recruiter, impeccably dressed, utterly charming, and he kind of took me under his wing because I'd arrived and I was wearing my brown M&S suit with I think I was obviously a white shirt because that was the only shirt you would wear, and I think he took pity on me. And over the next couple of weeks, he Pygmalioned me. Really, he took me out and taught me how to dress, how to act, how to do the recruitment thing, how to do the sales thing, how to talk to people. And we made a really good double act. I was his assistant. He was the main person driving things, but we had a really, really good time. The office was in Piccadilly Circus, so right in the centre of London. And there was occasional parties and occasional client entertaining. And it was absolutely brilliant. And again, it was this thing about saying yes. I said yes to everything. So they said, do you want to go to New York? Yeah, why not? What could go wrong? So I lived in New York for 6 weeks. And again, lived it up there because why not?
Why not?
And Craig got to go to Australia, so he needed somebody to come in every morning at 2 o'clock in the morning or 3 o'clock in the morning and liaise with him. And I was like, well, of course I will. I don't mind. So I got to see the wonderful world of night buses in London. And I'd work and finish at lunchtime and go home, and then...
You were already used to working night shifts anyway from your stint in Calais, I suppose.
Oh, yeah. Well, I was young, so it didn't really matter. I could sleep anywhere. Yeah. I joined a climbing club, which meant that we were going off climbing at weekends. And that meant that I met a lot of people. And again, it was this philosophy then was well embedded of say yes. So I was saying yes to everything. Yeah. So not just at work, but in my home life as well. So whenever the girls said, "Oh, we're doing this. Do you want to come along?" Well, yeah, why not? So I ended up. Some experiences were great. Most of them were bloody brilliant. If I'm honest, it was absolutely brilliant. I got to meet a whole bunch of other people from Operation Raleigh. It'd be Raleigh, wouldn't it? They were
a group of people that take people to different things.
It was so after university they took graduates, and they could go for a year go and do volunteer work somewhere, so build a school or help in education or dig a well. It was quite a big thing at the time.
I remember, and I looked into it. I was quite interested. Yeah.
So I think it's now Raleigh International, maybe it's called, rather than Operation Raleigh. So I got to meet people there and a whole new group of people, and that led me to helping out for Riding for the Disabled in London, which was again a real surprise to me. There are horses in London, quite a lot of them. So we used to have to ride the horses out from Lancaster Gate to Hyde Park. And we usually ended up doing it at rush hour. So I used to ride horses through rush hour traffic into Hyde Park.
No ULEZ in those days.
I don't know what the ULEZ would be on a horse. I mean, they did crap quite a lot, but you didn't worry about that. But that was quite fun. Again, it's just one of those things that you would never really imagine yourself doing, riding through rush hour traffic in London on a horse. And that game was a great experience because it was in Hyde Park. It was opposite the Horse Guards barracks. So when the weather was bad, they were lovely guys, the guys at the Horse Guard barracks. They would let us go in and use their indoor arena, and then they would come along and help us with some of the disabled kids, because lifting them on and off a horse is quite a heavy thing, and you've got to be really careful in some cases.
What amazing scheme as well.
Oh, yeah, the riding for disabled, they loved it. Riding on a horse is one of life's glories anyway. And the way they lit up and came alive when they were on the back of a horse, even when they were just being led around the ring, it was absolutely amazing. Like I said, I got to hang out with guys at Horse Guards. They were disgustingly handsome. So they were lovely, disgustingly handsome, and they looked incredible in their get-up. So it was a little bit intimidating at times. No, they were really, really nice guys, and they were always willing to help out. So again, it was another example where I just kept saying yes, and it led me from A to B to C to D, and then I was riding a horse called Thunder through high traffic at Hyde Park. Yeah,
amazing. It'd clearly been Nayless, by the way, the name of that zone.
Oh, Nayless. Oh, yeah. And all right, it's that kind of podcast, is it?
It's been a long time. Sorry, So and then after that, then what? So you're doing the recruitment, you're doing the whole.
So I then for the next 10 years was working through recruitment.
Okay. In central London for 10 years.
Yeah.
Wow.
So started off doing it as on the agency side, then I moved in house. started working at Nortel on a contract, and then I worked at PwC, and then I ended up being the global director of IT recruitment at GSK.
Right.
Which was an amazing role.
That's a big role.
Well, at the time, because they'd just merged GlaxoSmithKline, we were depending on which numbers you use, the second or third largest IT company in the world.
Yeah.
Purely because of the merger, and they were trying to bring everything together. But there was also the research side of things as well, which was using some really cutting edge technology. So the work was incredibly interesting. So you had the research side of things, which was interesting, because GSK at the time was testing on animals. Because it was a requirement, I'm not going to defend either way, but so their Stevenage site was constantly under attack, both physically and at that point there was the start of cyber attacks. So I was responsible for hiring sort of the first people involved in cybersecurity, even before it was kind of a thing.
Which is huge now, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. But again, fascinating. It was new areas, new ways of doing things. I was travelling the world, which was amazing.
Yeah.
I'd gone from my first flight at 21 to travelling on business flights and actually getting a bit bored with flying. So yeah, it was quite a journey. During that time, I met my wife as well. Well, she wasn't my wife at the time. My girlfriend.
Had a wife.
So we ended up both working at PwC at the same time. My wife has always worked at PwC, so I kind of arrived at PwC. But that's not. People think that's how we met, but we didn't. We met outside of while I was applying to PwC, and then we started dating just before I started at PwC. But I was there for 2 years. But I was on the support side of things, and she was on partner track. So
it wasn't one of those. We're going to the pub after you applied to go, was it?
No, not this time. Yeah. There was quite a lot of drinking. No, I shouldn't say that. So yes, really enjoyed the whole recruitment thing. An in-house for me was more enjoyable than doing the agency stuff.
I was going to say, I think from being on the agency side, I never did it because I transitioned into IT, but I always liked the idea of the internal side more. I don't know why.
For me, it was the fact that you were far more embedded in the business. When you're the agency side of things, you only see the end of the process. And also, you put people in, then you never see them again.
It's more tangible because you're building a team of people you see on a frequent basis. Yeah.
So you get to hear about things and understand what's going on in the business and then add more value, because I was able to, much earlier in the process, say, well, look, you're going to struggle to find these people. It's going to take longer than you've planned for, or are you sure about this being the right place for the team? So there's a lot more value I could add there. And then over time, gradually the building starts filling up with people you've recruited, which is quite nice, usually, unless they've crapped out, in which case you never saw them again. But it was good to be part of that whole process. And I really enjoyed it. GSK was a really nice company to work for. They'd just merged, so there was a lot of energy, a lot of positive feelings about things, a lot of ideas that we could become something great here. That's why we've merged. So we were in the new building, which isn't the new building anymore, but the new building over on the A40.
The A40, yeah.
That was amazing building.
It was very cool. Like always driving through that when I was younger, I was like, look at that.
Yeah. Oh, when you were younger, thanks. Well, I was in there. And that was also the time of 9/11. I had just joined, I think I was maybe 2 months in when 9/11 happened. So first of all, terrible thing anyway, but I knew people who were out there. That was all very stressful. I was one of the first people to fly into New York afterwards, and that was heartbreaking. I mean, you could still feel it in the air, you could still taste it. The New Yorkers were obviously in shell shock about the whole thing. And trying to then do the role globally and try to have some kind of normality in the face of that kind of trauma was interesting as well. trying to have some kind of normality, because things had to keep going. We couldn't just stop. So that was challenging on an emotional level, challenging on a logistical level, challenging on a physical level. Because walking around New York at the time was difficult. You couldn't really breathe the air. And also the travel times, going through security and everything else. I mean, it was a nightmare.
It was a horrible time, and funnily enough, I must have just missed you, because my wife and I had done the Bunac summer in at Cape Cod, and we'd gone back to New York because that's his first touch point, isn't it, when you get to New York, and then you go off and you come back. So we were driving through Manhattan about 2 days before it happened. And then we flew back and graduated the day after 9/11 had happened. But my sister had been to see us, and she'd gone to Manhattan afterwards, and we'd said, go up the Twin Towers, it's the best view of the city. And she was marooned in New York when it happened.
Oh, okay.
But so I used to speak to her every day and stuff. I remember the...
Yeah, I mean, it was terrifying, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And it changed the world.
Yeah, I mean, when planes took off, people were clapping, and, it must have been horrendous just being caught up in all of that.
Yeah, it was. So yeah, that was the background that was going on at the time as well. So the thing that really changed at that point. So if I quickly sketch out how our life was at the time. So Jo was my wife. Is my wife. She was on the partner track at PwC, so she was working 60, 70 hours a week. She's a tax advisor at PwC, so long hours. I was spending up to 2 weeks every month in America. So we were very much ships that were passing in the night a lot of the time. And then Jo had a breast cancer scare. Oh. And suddenly our world just kind of collapsed again. I didn't want to travel. She was couldn't focus on work. As it turns out, it wasn't anything in the end. It was benign. But for 2 or 3 weeks, everything changed. And one of the things that came out of it was that they said to her, look, with all the tests that we've done, we know that you've got high blood pressure, that you've got certain other things. At some point going into too many details. But the main point was that if you want to have children, you've got to have them now. If you leave it any longer, then you won't. It'll kill you having children. You can't do it. So they gave us a 2-year window, really. So we went from being very focused on our careers to suddenly thinking, well, what do we do now? Do we want a family or not? If we do want a family, how is that going to work? So we spent several months talking about it because it was a big decision. I was enjoying my job, Jo was enjoying her job, but we decided first of all that we did want a family. And then in terms of how that would practically work, we were at a bit of a stalemate for a while because neither of us really wanted to give up what we were doing. So we'd also decided if we were going to do that, we didn't want to go down the nanny route or anything like that. There's nothing wrong with that at all. It's just for us, we thought if we are going to have a family, we want to engage with that family. There's not point having kids if we're not going to engage with having kids. So we thought one of us has got to give up work. And it was a bit of a stalemate for a while. But again, life intervened and I was told at GSK that they were going to outsource HR. Well, so one of the byproducts of the merger, they decided that they were going to outsource HR, including recruitment. So I thought, well, okay, well that's a sign really. I don't really want to go and work for some other company that is insourcing HR to GSK. That's like working at an agency. It feels like a backward step. So I remember distinctly, we were sitting in the car park at Stanage Edge in the Peak District. We spent the day climbing. And I just said, look, how about if I give up work? You work, I give up work, I raise the kids, I stay at home. And it was a bit of a radical thought at the time. Jo was uncertain whether it was the right thing to do because she thought, well, isn't that odd? It doesn't fit in with the traditional roles. But we talked about it and we decided, actually, no, that was the right thing to do. Sorry. She was definitely on the partner track, which is a much more stable career. And I could cook, so it kind of works out.
Just get 300 kids in the room.
Yeah, exactly. So I resigned from GSK. They weren't very happy because they were hoping I would be one of the people to help them do the transition with the outsourcing. But in the end, I left GSK, and we actually moved to Manchester.
Oh, right.
Because we thought, if we're going to do this, why be in London? Why not take the opportunity to work? Because, Joe could work from wherever.
Yeah.
So with both of us not being tied to London anymore, we thought, well, why not? So we moved to a beautiful little village in Cheshire called Bollington. Joe was working out of Manchester, and I found myself with time on my hands because it took a while for us to conceive. So I was twiddling my thumbs for a few weeks, and I thought, well, why don't I go back to university? I had seen some adverts for the Open University. I thought, well, flexible study, that could work with having a kid. So, in the sense that if we did conceive, I could always put it on hold. So I started studying a psychology degree with the OU.
Is that something you've thought about for a little bit of time, that you might want to do that further down the line?
Well, it goes back to this whole thing about science. I've always been interested in science, and I'm sure there are people out there who go, well, psychology isn't a science. I would argue otherwise. But it was about going back to that sort of more scientific way of looking things, because within the psychology degree that I did, because it was the OU, it was very modular, so I went very much on the sort of hardcore neuroscience side of things, rather than the social psychology or educational psychology or anything like that. It was very much the cognitive side of psychology.
You had the benefit of all those experiences you've just talked about as well, in between your initial studying as well.
And sorry, just to dig into that a little bit. So what does that mean? Sort of more of the sort of neuro, like, does that mean it's more theory based? It's more kind of
well, there's two ways of looking at the human mind. Are you ready for the lecture?
Yeah, I'm all in.
There's the more social behavioural approach, which sort of assumes that the mind is a sort of black box, and it doesn't matter what's going on in there. It matters what people do.
Right.
And how people respond. So you were looking at the inputs and their outputs in terms of behaviours. So that's social psychology, behavioural psychology. It doesn't require any understanding. So the really crude analogy, I've never really liked this, but it kind of works, is a bit like using a computer. You don't need to know how a computer works or know how to do coding. You can still use a computer, and you put inputs in and outputs come out. And
so is it almost like saying a little bit that people's mental health is shaped by their environment, what happens to them, and then something's processed, and then there's
exactly. But it's important. But the only things that are really important to study are the inputs, the environment, whatever, and then what happens afterwards, and then seeing whether you can help them with. So if their behaviour is off, they're depressed or anxious, then help them with that, not worry about what's actually physically going on in the brain. The other side is the neuroscience approach, the cognitive approach, which is that you can only really understand people's behaviour if you understand what's going on in the brain. So again, it's whether you consider the mind and the brain to be the same thing, whether the mind is an emergent property of the physical brain and therefore you need to understand the physical brain, or whether the mind is just the mind and it doesn't really matter where it comes from. It's about understanding how the mind works, as I said, which is the sort of more behavioural side of things. So I was more interested in the mechanics of how did this lump of grey flesh between our ears produce everything that we are? How did it produce Picasso and me and everybody else? And I'll put myself up there with Picasso, but how does it? Because when you look at it, it feels counterintuitive that something which is this sort of quite small piece of flesh between your ears is able to produce our experience of life. I mean, if you stop and think about our lives and how we do things and the knowledge we retain and the interactions and, the way we feel when we see a sunrise, how does that compute? What use is it?
how do you say yes to everything?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
But and how you how you store memories and memories with emotions attached to them, and how you remember certain things, the way you partition that stuff.
Yeah.
It's
So is it almost like a little bit more structural? So the synapses, the electric signals, neuroplasticity.
At the time I started doing it, it was at the end of a period which was known as neuropsychology, which looked at people with brain damage. So you'd be able to say, okay, well, this person's behaviour has changed, or they can't form new memories, or they've lost language ability. And then when you looked at their brains using various scanning techniques, you could see where there was damage, lesions on the brain, and say, well, okay, well, that area is most likely then linked to language if they have a language deficit, or it's how they kind of map they map the general areas of the brain in terms of. So it was even things like you could see where somebody had a stroke and they lost use of their left arm. You could see on the
connection
where the part was. So, but then you'd be able to say, well, that bit there obviously controls the left arm, kind of thing. So it was quite crude, but it did teach us a lot. And I arrived just at the point when we were getting the technology that could start looking at a bit more detail about how synapses worked, how the different cells in the brain worked, the fact that there were different cells in the brain and what they did. And that was really quite exciting. It wasn't, I didn't arrive just at that point. It was already there and I was studying it.
And just quickly, what was it that even made you think of going down that track?
Well, for example, I've been a subscriber to New Scientist magazine pretty much all my adult life.
I used to, on my paper round, someone used to read that. I always have to quick thumb through before I delivered it.
Wait, that was me. No. So I'd always maintained that interest, and I always read. I have read A Brief History of Time. So I'd always kept an interest there. So when I decided to go back to university, I thought, well, I'm now in a position where I'm fortunate enough that I can choose whatever I want to do. And I thought about going to physics, but by that point I'd realised not really for me. Chemistry had never really appealed. Biology is barely a science. I'm kidding, it's a science. So by that point, probably because of all my experiences doing recruitment and talking to people and being in HR, I was more interested in going down the psychology route.
Makes sense.
And so I was looking at the neuroscience side of things, and I was also became very interested in human deception. Straightforward link now from recruitment to looking at that in my psychology degree, because it reached a point where I was interviewing where I could tell when people were lying, and sometimes it was obvious. Exactly. Or through inflections in their voices, or I'd interviewed enough people, I'd built up a sort of mental body of information where I could tell with reasonable accuracy. But it wasn't so much that, it was a case of why were they lying? And also how did they lie? And, how did that work? Because if you stop and think about it, people lying is quite an interesting process because you have to be aware of what reality is and then substitute it with another reality. And some people can do that really, really well, and I won't name names, but and they base their careers on it. Other people can't do it at all.
And you can see that as clear as day if you're seeing said person being interviewed on the
Yeah, pretty much now. Yeah, but it's very much an art. Even the best people in the world who say they can do that, they're barely better than average.
Right.
If you could flip a coin, and they're only slightly better than that.
How old were you at this point, Chris, when you went back to study psychology?
I was 32.
See, I think this is really fascinating for me because a lot of people go to schools, or the system says you go to university at 18, you're done by 21, and then you work. And you're the proof in point that you thought you were going to go down the physics route. You had a wealth of experience, and all those experiences you'd had with different working environments and travelling in different countries.
Oh yeah.
And now you'd honed in on what you wanted. It's fantastic.
And that became my love for the next 8-9 years. In fact, I became known as by our mates as being a perpetual student. So during this time, we did conceive. We had our daughter. So I was staying at home looking after her, studying my psychology degree. That worked really well in a way we hadn't anticipated, in that, again, showing my age, there was no paternity leave back then. But Jo got maternity leave. I was off anyway. So for the first 4 months, we were both at home looking after our daughter, which was a stroke of genius, really. Yeah. We were able to alternate night shifts on the feeding and all those kind of things. And Jo was there long enough at home to feel she'd created a bond with our daughter as well. Yeah. So yeah, we had our daughter up she's a northerner, she was born in Macclesfield General. But shortly afterwards, again, our life took a bit of a left turn in that we had to move back down to London because Jo was offered an opportunity that she couldn't say no to. If she wanted to make partner at PwC, then we'd have to move back down to London.
Which, let's face it, it's a fairly life-changing move, that. The partner at PwC.
Oh yeah, and it's what she'd been working to for at that point for over 10 years. Yeah. So it was a no-brainer, really. Yeah. But I couldn't bring myself at that point, because we were living in the edge of on Bollington. It's the edge of the Peak District. The view from our living room window was across the Peak District. I said, I can't move back into London. And we've got a child now as well. So I remember we drew this sort of swathe around northwest of London where I was prepared to live, where Jo could commute into work, which is how we ended up where we are now.
Right.
So we originally lived in Coles Hill, and then we've moved to Winchmore Hill now. And we've been here now for, 17, 18 years.
Wow.
Anyway, so during that time, I continued with my psychology degree, finished that. Went on to do a master's in cognitive neuropsychology.
How long did the degree take to complete?
The degree took me 4 years in the end.
4 years, okay.
Yeah. Which wasn't too bad. I thought it would take longer, but babies are quite easy.
Yeah.
They just kind of sit there and sleep. So I managed to get quite a lot done. It was the final year that took longer, partly because I was doing so there are different kinds of psychology degrees, or there was back then. It might all be one group now, I don't know. But there were two real main ones where you could just study psychology as a general subject, or you could study it to be a psychologist. And the difference really was the rigour of what you studied, and also you had to do a couple of residentials with the OU to do proper experimental work. So that was a bit difficult to juggle with Jo and our daughter. So it took a little bit longer, but it was only 4 years in the end. So I did all right on that. I got a 2-1, I think.
Your parents pleased when you graduated for the second time?
Well, you see, that's a tricky thing, because my dad didn't speak to me for 6 months when I said that I was going to become a house husband.
Wow.
It was a very, very interesting experience. A lot of people were supportive, but in the sort of sense of, that's a bit weird, but whatever. My dad and a few other people almost seemed offended that I had taken on what was a woman's role. So it took him a while to warm up to the idea. And he thought, I think, to a certain level as well, that I was throwing my career away, my life away. I'd worked so hard to get to where I was, and now suddenly it didn't matter. I had friends of Jo's accusing me of being a gold digger, that, this was my plan all along, that I was going to become some man of leisure. And I was thinking, well, that's a hell of a long con, isn't it? Because all the way from meeting her to marrying her to working for all these years, and now suddenly, yes, I'm going.
And all those experiences that you had, that you talked about as well.
So that was. It took a while for things to thaw between me and my dad, and I can't honestly say that he was that proud of me, because he didn't really understand what a psychology degree was about. He understood in principle, but he didn't understand, because I was doing the more hardcore scientific side of psychology. There wasn't, again, a lot that he could truly understand. But by that point, my dad had thought a little bit and had appreciated that me staying at home did make sense, and that it wasn't some weird thing to do. But it was all very interesting, because we up north, when we in Bollington, nobody batted an eyelid. So our daughter came along, and I would go along to mothers and toddlers groups, and they were all absolutely fine. When I moved down here to Buckinghamshire, I've got to say, people were horrible. The local NCT group wouldn't let me join.
What?
They said that it would make everybody feel uncomfortable. I was like, well, why don't we find out rather than just saying no? But I wasn't allowed to join. We used to go along to this tumble tots thing, and nobody would speak to me. We had another thing we went to, which was like a singing session, and it was all in a sort of semicircle around the woman who was doing the singing. And I would arrive and I'd sit down, and all the other mums would arrive, and they'd kind of sit on the other quarter circle and leave me. It was almost as if I was contagious somehow.
What? That's a really strange. I mean, I obviously the world's moved on significantly since then, and it wasn't that long ago from what you were saying. But that's a really strange experience.
Well, it was 19 years ago, so it was a different time.
So I think
weirdly,
what I could sense though, like instantly, what comes to my mind, and I've lived in this area for my whole life.
Okay,
is the societal norm stuff, the societal judgment. I bet it was difficult for your wife as well.
Absolutely.
I bet it was probably even harder, in fact, you know, in terms of that concern of that judgment of, you know, that's not what a mum does.
Oh yeah. She got people saying quite horrible things to her at work about, you know, well, you're obviously choosing your career over your own daughter. What is wrong with you? You know, you're not a proper mom. It was difficult. It was really difficult.
I can imagine. I think it's really disappointing. It's
really,
you know,
yeah.
It was really disappointing. It didn't change actually until my daughter went to school. So we moved down here when my daughter was 6 months old. So for 4.5 years, I was effectively socially ostracised. Nobody wanted to meet us. Nobody wanted to spend time with us. We were totally reliant actually on existing friendship groups, to the point where we started to think, do we want to live here? What's the point?
You knew no one when you moved here, effectively.
No, we didn't know.
People outside of work in different areas. No.
Yeah. So we knew other people from other things, but we didn't know anybody in the local area. But we didn't think that would be a problem. We thought, well, you know, we'll slot right in. But it was not to be. So that was... It was horrible. It was really horrible. And part of it in the end was I just gave up. I mean, the things we went to, the tumble tot stuff, the singing groups, I kind of steeled myself to do that because I wasn't going to let my daughter suffer.
Yeah.
So I would force myself to go along and put up with this, and then, you know, treat us to a cake and an ice cream or something afterwards, because I thought it was vital that my daughter got to socialise.
Absolutely.
Even if I couldn't. And it's slightly thawed, but actually really nothing shifted, as I said, until my daughter went to school.
Yeah.
So I've forgotten where I was now.
So did you build a network once you started school? You built a network of people that were a bit more accommodating and... Well,
again, I'm going to name drop somebody now. There's a lovely woman called Pip Dad, whose daughter started at the same school at the same time. The first couple of times I did drop off and pick up, totally ignored by all the moms. And then about the third one I did, on day 3 or whatever, Pip just out of the blue came up to me and went, "So who are you?" And we started talking, and she's lovely and she knows everybody. She's lived here all her life as well. So she kind of made me her mission to introduce me to everybody.
Brilliant.
And make people realise that I wasn't some kind of monster. You know, it was to varying degrees of success over the next few years. But we then started making friends, and they're still friends with them now. You know, and our kids have grown up all together, and that made a big difference. Suddenly we thought, actually, no, we can stay here. We can have a life here, because the barriers have started to break down a little bit. And I think as well, socially, I think that was a really important period, because I think being a house husband became less of a weird thing. It was accelerating during that bit, and paternity leave came along, and the world was shifting. I mean, as we were more of a service-based economy, it doesn't have to be the man who stays at home. The woman who stays at home. Cognitive bias there for you, as far as I'm concerned. It is the man who stays at home. So that eased off a little bit as well, and people got to know me and Joe and realised that we weren't weirdos. We just made a certain number of decisions that at the time to us seemed perfectly reasonable, and were the right thing for us and our family.
And for what you were saying, it took you months to work through that decision as well, didn't it?
Yeah,
you contemplated all the different,
Oh yeah, absolutely. But not because either of us was bothered about being at home, but because neither of us wanted to give up our careers.
Yeah, exactly,
And I don't regret it at all, if I'm honest. I've managed to carve a different path, which I thoroughly enjoy, so it's not really been an issue.
It's just such a shame that people have to meet things that isn't normal, in inverted commas, with fear and mistrust, and especially when, you know, obviously having kids is magical, but it's intense, it's tough, there's a lot to adapt to for everybody. I just find it so incomprehensible. Like, I just don't think I would ever go into that situation if I, you know, and be sort of standoffish or difficult. I just don't understand that mindset.
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head. It's that sort of fear thing, isn't it? It's that. I mean, afterwards, after talking to people, I realised that I was a threatening figure.
Exactly.
I mean, I'm quite a big bloke. I was the only man there. It made people feel uncomfortable. For some of them, it was a case of, well, what's wrong with him? Can't he get a job? Is he some kind of, you know, is he some kind of gold digger? Is he some kind of waste of space who's just living off his wife or what?
Why be so suspicious? I just don't, you know, again, I'm not a psychologist. I haven't studied social sciences, but I just, again, that's...
Well, as a defensive mechanism, if we are going to go down the psychology route, from a defensive mechanism, it makes complete sense, doesn't it? I mean, we are basically still tribal exactly. in our core responses. So... You know, if some strange bloke turns up in your village, it makes a lot more sense to be wary than to just welcome him with open arms.
Makes sense.
So I think there's a layer of that, but I think it's actually it's more subtle. It was a question. It was a case of what was I? Why was I doing this? Because they couldn't actually conceive that I'd chosen to do it. And I do quite a lot of work with house husbands now, and that's still an issue that people still think. Wait a minute. So they can understand that maybe economic circumstances have forced you to stay at home as a dad, you know. But to choose it is a very unusual thing, even now, to quite a lot of people. So I was this weird unknown entity. So I've had the police grab me because they thought I parked in a car park in Beaconsfield. I left Megan in the car where I went to get the ticket, and a policeman had seen me with a kid in a car, and it was middle of the day on a Wednesday or something. So he came over and said, "What are you doing? What have you done with that child?" I was like, "Well, it's my daughter. What did you do?" And he was like, No. We need to. And he called it in, and police car arrived, and a female WPC was there to. And I was thinking, what the hell is going on? And he genuinely thought that I'd kidnapped this child, because why else would a man on a Wednesday afternoon be?
Jeez.
I was like, well, there's a million reasons why that could be the case. So I don't know if it's something about my face or my demeanour.
Well, if it makes you feel any better, I took my daughter to Barcelona, and the security guy at customs said, "Have you got a letter from the mother giving you permission?"
What?
And I was like, permission to take my own daughter to Barcelona?
Yeah.
So it's not just I've obviously got the same thing on my face where people. I mean, but yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, I was told to carry our marriage certificate and birth certificate with us. If I was ever travelling with Megan by myself.
I mean, obviously, it's good to have safeguarding, and you know, obviously,
absolutely.
You know, we all know how rife people trafficking is, but.
Oh, and they spoke to Joe on the phone, and once they realised that it was absolutely fine, and it helped them. My daughter was there going, "Daddy." It's like, see, they were very apologetic.
But I think when you're, you know, when it's something you've had to do, you know, like obviously. No, they probably meant had the right interest behind it. But again, there's ways of dealing with it.
Yeah.
You never know people's level of vulnerability. It's just, it's daft. I mean,
it was the assumption that I was something deviant.
Yeah.
But I mean, you know, that was the same on the school playground at the beginning. Yeah, the moms were looking at me with suspicion.
I mean, let's face it. primary school playgrounds are a flipping cluster of
oh dear God, they're a
politics
nightmare.
and absolute waste of life nonsense. That I literally, from doing enough of it, I can't believe the dynamics that go on.
It's a minefield, it really is. So that was another dimension that was going on in the first few years we were down here. And I think at that point I was clinging on to my studies. At that point I was studying at Oxford Brookes. So the 2 days I was going into Oxford Brookes, where I was treated like a normal person, became my sort of sanctuary. So I loved it so much that at the end of that one I did another master's at Oxford Brookes in cognitive neuroscience.
Wow.
Because it was a new course they were rolling out. So they said, well, look, if you want to, you can, for half price kind of thing, stay and do another year and get another master's in neuroscience. So I did that as well.
So were you actually practicing during any of this education, or was it literally?
No. I was just studying at the point.
So total was 4 years.
4 years, yeah,
and then another year, then another year.
So 4 years of doing my BSc, 3 years to do the 2 masters, and then I went on to start a PhD at the Open University.
Wow.
And that was in the neuroscience of deception. So that was kind of my dream, really. I was studying the subject I wanted to study, and the Open University campus at Milton Keynes is brilliant because it's like a university, but there's no undergrads. So it's lovely. It's only people doing research, and the admin people as well.
You mean by undergrads not smoking weed, eating kebabs, and
just being generally annoying.
Speaking from experience,
maybe.
So I was doing that. I was 2 years into that when I started to feel ill, and that was the next bit that changed our lives completely. So at that point, Megan was at school. We were quite settled. Joe had made partner at PwC, so everything was looking like it had all come together rather nicely. But in 2013, it would have been, in February, I had some stomach pains, and I went to the GP, and they dismissed it as a grumbling appendix, and said, if you get it again, just take some aspirin or paracetamol and see how it goes. So in December, it started flaring up again. So I followed their advice. I took some paracetamol, tried to push through the pain, which, as it turns out, was really dumb advice because my appendix burst. So I didn't know that at the time. I woke up in the morning in complete agony. So my wife took my daughter to school, took our daughter to school, took me to the GP, and the GP diagnosed a kidney infection. So he sent me to Wickham, which is where the department is for that.
Presumably, you could point, isolated where the pain was.
But by that point, because I'd left it so long, which I suppose is on me, but the infection had spread to my bladder, so I was peeing blood, basically.
Right.
So it wasn't. So he was right, except that there was a much bigger thing going on in the background, which is that my appendix had burst. So the guys at Wickham, I was in total agony. So the guys, the team at Wickham, they quickly established that yes, I did have an infection, but the scan had also shown that my appendix had perforated, it had blown. So they said we need to rush him for surgery. So they sent me to Stoke Mandeville. Lovely. I mean, you don't want to be in an ambulance in that much pain, bouncing along the roads between Wickham and Stoke Mandeville. I mean, the paramedics were brilliant. The woman in the back who was helping me was sort of doing her best to stop me moving around too much because every time I was kind of screaming. So we arrived at Stoke Mandeville at 11 o'clock in the evening.
It's always 11 o'clock in the evening. You can never go there at like...
No.
Never go like 10 o'clock in the morning, just like nice convenient time.
Yeah, when there's doctors and people to help.
Yeah.
So I arrived at 11 o'clock. And there was, I don't remember too much about it, but I do remember the paramedics having a stand-up argument with some guy there because he was saying, well, we can't admit this guy, we haven't got his paperwork.
Oh,
and they were like,
God.
look, he's dying, you've got to admit him. So he agreed to admit me to Stoke Mandeville, and he put me in some ward somewhere. And I was kind of in and out of consciousness by that point. And they hooked me up to some pain meds. And then I remember the next morning lying there thinking, okay, well, what's going on now? And we've got a friend, a guy called Mark, who's a doctor at Stoke Mandeville. So in the intervening time, my wife had called Mark and said, oh, Chris has gone to Stoke Mandeville. Do you mind checking on him and seeing him? So he'd gone down to the admissions area and there was no record on me. So I was lying there thinking, that sounds like Mark. And he sounds really angry because he was shouting, what do you mean you've lost my mate? He's coming here with a burst appendix. How can you have lost him? Where is he? And they were starting to panic thinking, oh my God. And I was kind of waving my hand, kind of going, I'm kind of here. So they eventually found me. And so I went in for surgery, appendectomy number 1. And everything seemed fine. I came out. I had a collapsed lung, which was unusual. But they thought that was because I'd gone into it quite late. I was already quite sick and they were treating me for the urinary infection and it was obviously in my bloodstream by that point. But they thought, put him on antibiotics, he'll recover. And for 24 hours I did. And then I started getting sick again. And I got really sick really quickly. To the point where the nurses didn't really believe it.
And you were at home, or you?
No, I was at the hospital at the time. Yeah. So because I'd had a collapsed lung, they'd kept me in.
Yeah, right.
If I hadn't of that, they would have sent me home because you're lucky if you get one night. If it's,
I was going to say because
appendectomy,
it sounds crazy, but it's amazing how quickly they want to get you out.
Yeah,
So.
yeah. Well, good reason I think because you don't want any
Absolutely.
post-operative issues.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is sometimes bizarre how life works. So I was in one bed. Across from me was a guy who'd had a burst stomach ulcer, which was far worse really than my appendix, and he was really suffering. And we kind of bonded a little bit. And I'd helped him out because he'd forgotten his mobile phone, so I helped him call his daughter, and also there'd been an incident over meds where I was lying there, and this is because I'd watched things like House MD. I was lying there and a nurse came along and was saying, okay, well, we need to give him an injection of warfarin. And I was thinking, wait a minute, he's already had that. You can't have 2. That's bad. Based purely on TV, by the way. So I kicked up a bit of a fuss and I realised actually, yeah, the doctor had forgotten to write down the previous injection. So it was
for you, Chris, or the guy opposite?
That was for him.
Yeah, yeah.
So he was, I mean, they would have, if there'd been a reaction, I'm sure they would have sorted it out, but it saved it getting any worse for him. Yeah. So we kind of bonded a little bit. And I got so bad so quickly that nobody really was paying attention. And it was him who saved me because he kicked up a real fuss.
Were you hooked up to much?
I was, yeah. And the alarms were going off, but they didn't really... I don't know what was going on. There was just no attention being paid to me at all. And I think it was partly because they'd assumed that I was fine. He's had his appendectomy, done. So they were dealing with other things. So he cooked up a real big fuss. The nurses eventually realised, and they put me on a huge dose of morphine, and it had no effect on the pain. And they realised that something had gone really wrong.
Hey everyone, that's the end of the first half of Chris's podcast. Hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Stay tuned for next week's, which is the second half, and trust me, it gets even better, and you don't want to miss that one. Really looking forward to that. I hope you have a great week, and until then, there's another way.
I think I'm starting to fade again. I don't want